the Heidel Minicast. And now, Scott Clark.
On today's minicast, I want to wrap up our introduction to J. Gresham Machen, Christianity and Liberalism, published in 1923, 100 years ago this year, by Macmillan in New York. And I want to do two things in this episode. First, I just want to walk through the volume briefly, give you an overview, give you sort of a big picture view, and then in subsequent episodes, I will read selections from each of the chapters. And again, all of this is just to whet your appetite so that you will get a copy of this for yourself. Either buy a copy or check one out from the library, or if your local library doesn't have one, there is a marvelous service provided both by public and private libraries. It's called interlibrary loan. Not everybody knows about this. If you pay taxes, then some of those go to your local public library, and this is one of the services for which you are paying. You can call your library, or you can stop in and ask to talk to the librarian in charge of the interlibrary loan program. Some libraries are large enough to have a person dedicated to doing nothing but interlibrary loan. And you need to know the author, you need to know the title. It's helpful to know the publisher, the year, and you are not likely to find a volume from 1923. I just happened to find this in a little town north of Kansas City. This came from Park College, Kansas City. They had a library sale, and I don't remember why we were there, but we happened to stop in, and I was looking at books on a table, and lo and behold, there was Machen, Christianity and Liberalism, a first edition from 1923, as far as I know. And not only that, it was signed, and I think they sold it to me for $5. I think I got the better end of that deal. I was astounded that they were selling this volume. Clearly, they had no idea the value of the book just monetarily, nor did they have any idea of the value of the book intrinsically, according to what's in it. At any rate, so that is another possibility. You might find a used copy somewhere. And of course, you can always look online. Lots of places carry used copies, and there are multiple editions of Christianity and Liberalism. Not too many years ago, our colleagues in Philadelphia at Westminster Theological Seminary, I think, published an edition, and Carl Trueman wrote a preface or a foreword or something, and to the best of my knowledge, that's the most recent, but there may yet be another volume. So that's my encouragement, is for you to get a copy of Machen's Christianity and Liberalism and read it for yourself. And it's quite manageable. The text of the book is only 180 pages, and then there's an index in the back, and it's very readable. One of Machen's many virtues is that he was a good writer, a clear writer, an engaging and interesting writer. You will not have any difficulty reading this book. If the Heidelcast helps you, won't you help us keep it going? You can make the offer clink by clicking on the PayPal link on the Heidel blog, or by mailing a check to Heidelberg Reformation Association, 1637 East Valley Parkway, number 391, Escondido, California, 92027. There are 7 chapters in this volume. The first chapter is an introduction, and this is a chapter that's oft quoted, sections of which are oft quoted, and some of these chapters are actually available in audio. They've been read by Heidelberg Reformation Association board member and friend and contributor to the Heidel blog and Heidelcast, and that's Brad Isbell. So if you go to our resources page, which is linked both, you should be able to see it on your phone if you're listening on your phone, and otherwise you can look at the blog post for this episode, and you'll see a link to our resources page, or just go to heidelblog.net/resources, and you'll just page down or search, and you'll see the resource page for Machen, Christianity, and Liberalism. And so there are even some audio chapters that you can listen to while you're driving or mowing the lawn or whatever it is that you are doing. So introduction is the first chapter. Second chapter is on the necessity of doctrine. The third chapter is on God and man. Fourth is on the Bible, a defense of the Bible over against the liberal not politically or culturally, but theological liberals who are denigrating the reliability and truth of Holy Scripture. And of course, the theme through the whole book is the difference between Christianity as one religion and theological liberalism as another. And so he's showing the contrast all the way through. Chapter 5 is on Christ, and 6 on salvation, 7 on the church. Maybe one of the most significant quotes in the book, one of the passages that has attracted a lot of attention. I know in one case I lent my copy, this copy that I have in my hands, to a dear friend of mine. I took it with me when we went overseas. There are a couple of books with which I would not be separated. This was one of them. There are a few others, my old red UBS New Testament and a few others. And at any rate, this passage, I think, put him right off. Anyway, the passage says, in the sphere of religion, in particular, the present time is a time of conflict. The great redemptive religion, which has always been known as Christianity, is battling against a totally diverse type of religious belief, which is only the more destructive of the Christian faith because it makes use of traditional Christian terminology. The modern, non-redemptive religion is called modernism or liberalism. Both names are unsatisfactory. The latter, in particular, is question-begging. The movement, designated as liberalism, is regarded as liberal only by its friends. To its opponents, it seems to involve a narrow ignoring of many relevant facts. He goes on to say, but manifold are the forms in which the movement appears. The root of the movement is one. The many varieties of modern liberal religion are rooted in naturalism, that is, in the denial of any entrance of the creative power of God, as distinguished from the ordinary course of nature, in connection with the origin of Christianity. Well, that gives you a flavor of the way that Machen goes at things. There's one other issue that I'd like to address before we begin diving into the text of Christianity and liberalism, and that's one that has come up in recent years, and that is Machen's segregationist views. This is something about which I knew nothing for a long time. It only came up when somebody published an article, so it's something that needs to be addressed. We're talking here about 2 letters he wrote to his mother about the attempt to integrate Princeton. He also discussed this with colleagues at Princeton Theological Seminary and had a private discussion with his colleague, B.B. Warfield, about this issue. He was opposed to integrating the housing at Princeton Seminary. But just to be perfectly clear, I think Machen was completely wrong, and his views were contrary to the teaching of the New Testament, the integrity and truth of which he did so much to uphold. I think he was simply blinded by his own culture, and it's that culture about which I want to talk for just a minute. So the 2 letters he wrote to his mother about the attempt to integrate Princeton were never published and have not, to the best of my knowledge, have not been published in their entirety in what scholars call fair copies. The text available online doesn't constitute fair copies of the primary sources. This is, again, not an attempt on my part to vindicate Machen's segregationist views, which I repudiate, and anybody who's read the Heidel blog or paid attention to things that I've written would know that to be true. In fact, as we talk, I've got essays forthcoming, they haven't appeared yet, attacking a resurgent segregationism, which is making its ugly presence known again in our circles. In fact, I've indicted Machen for his racism and addressed the question of how we, who are the beneficiary of the civil rights movements of the 1950s and 60s, should think about him. And I've urged us not to repeat Machen's sins, for one thing, and 2, not to be anachronistic. And here I want to offer some context and some perspective on Machen's sins. We live in maybe the most amnesiac period in the history of the West. If we're to believe Machen's report, he was not alone. Anybody who knows the state of race relations in the early 20th century in the USA knows that Machen was not alone in his segregationist opinions. It was the law in the South, and it was the de facto custom in the North. I grew up on the Great Plains in the 1960s and 70s, and segregationist and racist sentiment was widespread. About Chicago, Dr. King famously said, quote, "I've been in many demonstrations all across the South, but I can say I've never seen, even in Mississippi and Alabama, mobs as hostile and hate-filled as I'm seeing in Chicago." Los Angeles was segregated. Some people have argued that the fact that B.B. Warfield was opposed to segregationism shows that Machen should have been able to overcome his racism. Well, perhaps. But I think that argument ignores the differences between Kentucky and Baltimore, or Balmer, as they say, or at least some say, and between the way Warfield was raised and the way Machen was raised. Kentucky initially attempted to remain neutral in the American Civil War, but early on sided with the Union. And as Fred Zaspel explains, quoting here, both of Warfield's parents had come from families of outspoken abolitionists and with important connections to the cause of emancipation, close quote. Warfield was, as Zaspel writes, quoting again, ahead of his time, close quote. He was the exception, not the rule. To look back at Machen, who was not raised by abolitionists, who grew up in a state that sided with the South, and to expect him to think like Warfield is anachronistic, it's unhistorical, and it's unrealistic. Machen was not from the de facto segregated North. He was from the de jure, according to law, segregated South. He was from an aristocratic family whose contact with Black Americans was limited to doormen, porters, and butlers. The list of racially progressive white people in his class and in his culture was very short indeed. Racism and segregationism, as I say, are sin. Machen was wrong, but it's bad history to expect Machen to have been anything other than what he was.
Thanks for listening. Tune in tomorrow for more from the Heidelcast, brought to you by HeidelbergReformationAssociation.org. Don't forget, when the coin in the coffer clinks, the cost of bandwidth shrinks. Copyright Heidelberg Reformation Association. All rights reserved. This is a Heidel Media production.